We have strong reason to believe that we know where the bodies of the children are, and recovery efforts are in process on that.
She was already gone before the first light cracked the horizon. And the man responsible, the man who had wrapped his bare hands around her throat while she begged him to stop, while she reminded him that the child they had named was still alive inside her body, that exact same man climbed into his work truck afterward. He punched the clock. He grinned at his co-workers. He picked up his phone calls. He ate his lunch. And when detectives showed up at his front door that same evening and looked him square in the eye, he told them he had absolutely no idea where his wife and children had gone. But that is not even the part that destroys you. The part that destroys you is what unfolded in that truck. In the suffocating darkness of an August morning, on a 40-mile drive out to an oil field no one would casually visit, 2 little girls, 4 years old and 3 years old, sat pressed together in the back seat. Their mother's body was on the floor beneath their feet, bundled in a bedsheet. And their father, the man they loved without condition, the man they reached for without hesitation, was behind the wheel. He had already decided. He already knew exactly what he intended to do when that truck pulled up to those oil tanks. He just had not done it yet. One of those little girls called out to him on that drive. She said, "Daddy, we know this because he said so himself." Years later, in a prison in the state of Wisconsin, to investigators who had flown across the country to hear it, he told them what she said without flinching, without breaking, with an absence of emotion on his face that investigators said they would carry with them for the rest of their careers. What she said after that single word, what her last words to her father actually were, will lodge itself in the mind of every person who has ever sat with this case. And after today, it will lodge itself in yours. This is not the story of a predator lurking in the shadows. This is the story of a man who coached his daughter's soccer team. A man who shared family photographs with hundreds of people online. A man who positioned himself in front of television cameras and manufactured tears, or attempted to, while his wife and children were already gone from this world. This is a story about the most terrifying species of evil that exists, the kind that smiles at the school gate. A warning before we go any further. This case involves documented violence against a pregnant woman and 2 children under the age of 5. What follows is serious, and it does not get easier. If you are in a vulnerable place right now, take a moment before you continue. We do not tell these stories for shock. We tell them so that the people who were taken from this world are never reduced to a statistic or a forgotten headline. If you are new to this channel, welcome to True Crime Blackwood. Every case we bring you is handled with the precision and gravity it deserves. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss a story, and tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from. We have a community that spans every continent and every time zone, and every single one of you is part of why we keep going. Now, let us talk about what actually happened inside that house in Frederick, Colorado, on the last night the Watts family existed as a family. Just after 5 in the morning, August 13th, 2018. Frederick, Colorado. A quiet suburb carved out of flat prairie land roughly 30 miles north of Denver, where fast-growing subdivisions sit almost comically close to oil drilling rigs, where the streets are swept and the neighbors know each other's children by name. The Windham Hill neighborhood is still completely dark at this hour, the kind of total pressing dark that belongs to the space before the rest of the world remembers it exists. But one man on Saratoga Trail is already moving. His name is Christopher Lee Watts. He is 33 years old, and what he is doing in these early morning hours, while his neighbors sleep, while the prairie sits still and silent, is something that investigators will unravel in under 40 to 8 hours. Something the rest of the world will spend years trying to understand. He brings his truck around. He reverses it into his own garage, backing it in, rather than pulling up to the street the way he does every other morning. That single detail is the first thing investigators will later circle, because every neighbor on that street will confirm the same fact. He never parked that way. The truck always sat on the street. Every single morning, without exception. Except this one. Directly across the road, attached to the front exterior of a neighbor's house, a security camera is rolling. It has been mounted there for some time. Its lens is aimed squarely at the Watts driveway. Christopher Watts does not appear to factor it into what he is doing. Investigators would later establish that he actually knew about that camera. He had seen it before. He knew it was there. And yet, he proceeded. Over the minutes that follow, the camera registers motion. He moves back and forth between the garage and the driver's side of the truck. Back and forth, back and forth, loading things. The angle of the lens, combined with the position he has chosen for the truck, makes it impossible to see precisely what he is placing inside the cab. He has parked it so that the truck bed partially blocks the camera's field of view. He has also, at some point during these same minutes, switched off an exterior light that had been shining in the direction of the camera. When people ask him afterward what he was loading, his answer never wavers. Work equipment, tools, a lunchbox, things he needed for a full day on the oil field. That is the explanation he gives. He gives it multiple times, to multiple people, in the hours that follow. At approximately 5:46 in the morning, according to the GPS telematics data later recovered from his work truck, he switches on the headlights. The truck pulls out of the driveway and turns left onto Steeple Rock Drive, the most direct path out of the neighborhood, the route that carries him out of the camera's reach. No one else leaves that house. He drives 40 miles north to a remote oil field site called Survey 319, operated by Anadarko Petroleum, the company that employs him. Geotab tracking data would later confirm his arrival at 6:53 in the morning. He stays at the site for more than 2 hours. At 7:18, he picks up his personal phone, takes a photograph of his work laptop screen, and sends it to a woman named Nichol Kessinger. The metadata embedded in that image confirms his location as the Survey 319 coordinates at the moment he takes it. He is sending her proof he is at work. She is not his wife. Later that morning, Nichol Kessinger tells investigators that Chris had asked her to FaceTime that day. She will say the call unsettled her, not because of anything specific he said, but because of what she could see in the background behind his face. She could see his bed, and the sheets were gone from it. She knew that was wrong. She did not yet understand why her instincts were screaming at her. His wife, Shanann, is 15 weeks pregnant with their third child. She arrived home from a business trip to Arizona at 1:48 in the morning, less than 4 hours before that truck reversed into the garage. She had walked through the front door of her own house in the dead of the night. Her doorbell camera captured every second of it. By mid-morning on August 13th, she has missed a prenatal appointment. She is not answering her phone. She is not responding to text messages. She is not responding to anything from anyone. Something happened inside that house in the hours between 1:48 and 5:46. To fully grasp what that something was, you need to understand who these people were, and what had been quietly building inside that house long before August 13th ever arrived. Christopher Lee Watts was born on May 16, 1985, in Spring Lake, North Carolina. By every external measurement, he was an unremarkable man, and that is not a dismissal. It is simply the most accurate thing anyone who had ever encountered him could honestly say. Quiet, helpful, frictionless. Colleagues at Anadarko Petroleum described him as the kind of person who fixed problems without making noise about it. Neighbors in the Windham Hill subdivision said he was pleasant. He waved, he maintained his yard, he caused no trouble. Before joining Anadarko, he had worked as a mechanic, hands-on, and practical work that suited his reserved temperament. More recently, he had been promoted from a rover position, which kept him outdoors at field sites for most of the working day, to field coordinator, which moved him inside an office environment. On paper, his career was moving in the right direction. His neighbor, Nathaniel Trenastich, the man whose security camera would become the anchor of the entire investigation, described the Watts family to police as an ordinary, everyday American family. He said Shanann had always been genuinely warm, that she had come over personally when they first moved in to welcome them to the neighborhood, that Bella and Celeste were always running around the yard, laughing, filling the street with noise. But when it came to Chris, Trenastic offered something different. Something that never made it onto the social media posts or into the neighborhood impression. He told officers on body camera footage recorded that same day that Chris could go cold, that there were times he simply would not wave or acknowledge anyone. And then Trinastich said something that investigators noted carefully. He told them he had actually heard the couple before, heard them full out screaming at each other at the absolute top of their lungs. He said, "Chris gets crazy." Those were his exact words, given to police on the same afternoon Shanann and the girls were reported missing. That detail had never appeared in the picture most people saw. The picture most people saw was the one Shanann herself had built, on Facebook, on Instagram, in video after video. Chris, the devoted husband. Chris, the outstanding father. Chris, the unwavering rock. He was married to Shanann Watts, the mother of his 2 daughters, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant once more, with a boy they had already given a name. Nichol Lee Watts. The family owned a 5-bedroom home at 2825 Saratoga Trail. 2 working parents, 2 daughters who could make an entire yard smile just by running into it, and a 3rd child already named and already expected. From any angle you chose to look at them, they were ordinary. Stable. Fine. That is precisely what made what came next so difficult to absorb. Not because the evidence was tangled or the timeline was complicated, but because the man at the very center of it had spent years ensuring that nobody would ever look closely enough to find what was underneath. Here is what the official discovery documents, more than 2,000 pages of case evidence, released by the Weld County District Attorney following. Sentencing. Tell us about the morning of August 13th, after Christopher Watts drove 40 miles to Survey 319 and arrived at 6:53. At 8:26 in the morning, he Googled the phone number for Primrose School. Primrose was the school where Bella and Celeste were enrolled. He found the number, dialed it, and when someone picked up, he informed them that his daughters would no longer be attending, they would not be coming back. He provided no reason. He simply delivered the information and ended the call. At 8:28, 2 minutes later, he called a woman named Ann Meadows. She was a real estate agent. He told her he wanted to sell the family home at 2825 Saratoga Trail. He wanted something smaller, he said. Ann Meadows suggested a property just around the corner, at 6508 Saratoga Trail, a house built by the same builder, with the same floor plan as his own. She told him to drive past it on his commute home from work, so she could use it as a comparison to price the listing. Chris told her he would. 2 phone calls, 8:26 and 8:28, back to back, made while his pregnant wife's body was buried 40 miles away in a shallow grave at that same oil field site, and while his 2 daughters had already been placed inside crude oil storage tanks. He pulled his daughters from their school. He launched the process of listing the family home for sale, and then he went back to the job and continued the rest of his workday. This is not what a man sounds like when he has snapped. This is not the behavior of someone submerged in guilt or drowning in the reality of what he has done. Those 2 phone calls are the signature of a man who has already moved on, reorganizing, closing out one chapter while lighting the next one. And the answer to how far back the plan had actually been running, that answer is one that even the seasoned investigators who built this case said they were not prepared for. By early afternoon on August 13th, a woman named Nicole Atkinson had exhausted every option available to her and was running out of patience. Nichol was one of Shanann's closest friends and also a professional colleague. Both were representatives for Lavelle, the wellness company whose Thrive product line Shanann sold and promoted across social media. The night before, it had been Nichol who drove Shanann from the airport to the house on Saratoga Trail after their shared business trip to Arizona. She had pulled up to the driveway at 1:48 in the morning. She had watched Shanann walk through her front door. Then, she had driven away. That was the last time anyone outside of that house ever saw Shanann Watts alive. Now it was early afternoon on August 13th, and Shanann had vanished from every form of communication. She had missed a scheduled prenatal appointment. Shanann did not miss prenatal appointments. Not someone 15 weeks pregnant who managed her health with the vigilance that lupus demands. Nichol had called her. She had sent texts. She had stood at the front door and knocked. She had reached out to mutual friends and asked them to try. Nobody could reach Shanann. And then there was the car. Shanann's car was sitting in the garage. Bella and Celeste's car seats were still installed inside it. The girls' shoes, the ones they wore without exception every single day, were lined up beside the front door. Shanann's own shoes were there too. If she had gathered the girls and walked out of this house, she had done it with no car seats, and none of their shoes. Before calling the police, Nichol called Chris. He told her Shanann had probably taken the girls on a play date and was likely still at a friend's house. When Nichol said she was calling the police regardless, Chris asked her to wait. He said he was about 45 minutes away and would head home immediately. He asked her to hold off until he arrived. Nichol called the Frederick Police Department anyway. At approximately 1:40 in the afternoon, Officer Coonrod responded to the call. He met Nichol and her son outside the house on Saratoga Trail. Together they checked the perimeter and tried to see through the windows. No sounds from inside. No movement. No voices. No trace of children anywhere in the building. Chris arrived while they were still outside. He pulled up, introduced himself to the officer, and was cooperative from the first word. He gave consent to search the house without a moment's hesitation. He walked Officer Coonrod through every room and answered each question put to him. What Officer Coonrod found inside that house made it increasingly impossible to explain away. Shanann's purse was sitting on the kitchen counter. Inside it were her car keys, her lupus medication, a condition she managed with absolute consistency, and a medical device that stopped Officer Coonrod completely, an EpiPen. Celeste, the younger daughter, had a severe and documented nut allergy. The EpiPen was not a precaution Shanann took occasionally, or when she remembered. It accompanied her daughter every single time they left the house together, without exception, and it was sitting on the counter of a house where Celeste was nowhere to be found. Shanann's phone was wedged between the cushions of the living room sofa. Her wedding ring was on the nightstand beside the bed. Both car seats were still in the car in the garage. All the shoes were still by the door. Nothing had been packed. No drawers had been opened. No closet had been disturbed. No bag had been pulled out. Everything that constituted Shanann's daily existence, her medication, her transport, her children's safety equipment, her means of communication, was still exactly where she had left it inside this house. And then there was the one detail that stood apart from everything else. Officer Coonrod noticed it during the walkthrough of the master bedroom. The room was tidy. The bed was made. But the top sheet, the flat sheet that should have been covering that mattress, was gone. In a home that was otherwise kept with near immaculate precision, one sheet had simply vanished. No obvious explanation. Chris offered none. That missing sheet would turn out to matter more than almost any other single piece of physical evidence investigators would find that day. Cadaver dogs were brought through the property. They did not alert inside the house. There were no signs of a violent physical confrontation anywhere. Nothing overturned, nothing broken, no damaged furniture, no evidence that the space had been torn apart by a struggle. Whatever had happened in this house, it had left no visible wreckage. The house was clean, controlled, orderly, to a degree that itself told a story. Officer Coonrod documented everything. The purse, the phone, the medication, the EpiPen, the wedding ring, the car seats, the shoes, the missing sheet, and the husband, who had arrived composed, cooperative, and willing, who answered every question put to him, who confirmed that yes, the marriage had been experiencing serious difficulties, that they had discussed separation, that they had talked about listing the house, and who maintained throughout all of it that he had no idea where his wife and daughters were. He told Officer Coonrod he had last seen Shanann that morning when he left for work around 5:15. She had still been in bed. The girls had been in their rooms. She had mentioned something about a visit to a friend's house later in the day. He drove to work. That was the last he had heard from any of them. He was standing in a house filled with his missing pregnant wife's untouched belongings, fielding questions from a police officer with a steady voice and a composed face. The Frederick Police Department contacted the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. The FBI was notified and brought in to assist. A neighborhood canvass was launched immediately, with investigators fanning out to speak to residents and pull any available surveillance footage from local businesses. An endangered missing alert was issued statewide for Shanann Watts and her 2 daughters, Bella and Celeste. What had begun as a welfare check was now something else entirely. And across the street, in the living room of the neighbor's house, Nathaniel Trinastich was setting up his television to show investigators, and Chris Watts, exactly what his security camera had captured in the darkness just after 5 that morning. Chris stood in that room and watched the footage play back on the screen. And the investigators watching him said the same thing afterward, independently of one another. He was not watching it the way a man watches footage when he is desperate to find his missing family. He glanced at the screen. He looked at his phone. He looked away. He looked back. He only spoke when the footage showed something he felt he needed to address. And what he needed to address was the absence of other vehicles. He kept pointing out that no other cars had come through, that no one else had approached the house. He was not searching for Shanann. He was managing what the camera had already captured. After Chris left the room, Nathaniel Trinastich turned to the officer present and said what he had been thinking since the welfare check began. He said, "I just do not understand why he keeps explaining himself over and over. He does not look worried. He looks like he is trying to cover his tracks." The house was immaculate. There was no sign of a struggle. Shanann's entire life was sitting precisely where she had left it, untouched. Bella and Celeste were nowhere, and the last person confirmed to have seen all 3 of them alive had just walked out of the neighbor's living room after spending more time staring at his phone than at the footage that might tell him where his family had gone. He said he had no idea where they were, but the camera had already told a different story, and the investigators who watched him watch that footage knew, in the quiet of that room, that the answers were not going to come from Christopher Watts volunteering them. They were going to have to pull every single one of them out. Shanann Catherine Rzucek was born on January 10, 1984, in New Jersey. She did not grow up there. Her family laid down roots in Aberdeen, North Carolina, a small town in Moore County, where connections between people run deep and hold long, where your neighbors remember your name and your mother's name and your grandmother's name, where family is not merely a word, but a structural force that holds everything else together. Shanann grew up inside that structure. Her parents were Frank Rzucek and Sandra Honorati Rzucek, Sandy as the family called her. Her younger brother was Frank Rzucek Jr., known as Frankie, and by every account the 2 of them were close in the way siblings are when they genuinely choose each other, not just because they share a last name. Shanann attended Pinecrest High School in Southern Pines. She was ambitious from an early age, the kind of person who moved deliberately toward things rather than waiting to see what came to her. In her senior year, she began dating a fellow student named Leonard King. The relationship accelerated fast. By the time she graduated, they were engaged, and not long after that, married. Some of her friends had worried she was moving too quickly, that she needed more time to understand herself before committing to a life with someone else. Shanann was not interested in slowing down. She was, as the people who knew her best consistently described it, utterly determined to begin her life. The marriage to Leonard King lasted several years. During that time, Shanann took on work managing a cell phone store in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and later became bookkeeper and manager for a custom car company called the Dirty South, which operated locations in both Fayetteville and Charlotte. She worked long hours. She built real skills. She became capable of running complex multi-site operations before she was 30 years old. But the marriage was fracturing. They tried counseling. It did not hold. By 2007, the couple had divorced, and by 2009, the split was finalized. Shanann relocated to Charlotte, enrolled in a psychology course at Queen's University, and set about rebuilding herself from the ground up. Then her health changed everything. In her early 20s, Shanann had been diagnosed with lupus, a chronic autoimmune condition in which the body's immune system turns against its own healthy tissue. Lupus is unpredictable and relentless. It can be managed, but it cannot be cured, and the flares it produces can be debilitating in ways that are entirely invisible from the outside. For Shanann, the diagnosis was a rupture. It forced her out of the career she had spent years constructing with her bare hands. 9 years of work, and then a medical reality that made continuing in the same way impossible. By her own account, the period that followed was one of the lowest of her life. She was unwell. She was rebuilding after a divorce. She was doing both simultaneously, largely without the professional identity she had fought so hard to build. It was during that period, in 2010, that a Facebook friend request arrived from a man she barely knew. His name was Christopher Lee Watts. He was from Spring Lake, North Carolina, not far from Aberdeen, though they had never moved in the same circles. A mutual friend had connected them, figuring they might get along. At the time, Shanann did not act on it immediately. But eventually, the conversation started. And one thing, as she herself later described it, led to another. The online connection became something real. He had come into her life at the absolute lowest point she had known, and she gave him credit for that, publicly, repeatedly, and with unmistakable sincerity, for years afterward. By November 3, 2012, Shanann Watts and Christopher Watts were married in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. She was 28. He was 27. They relocated to Colorado shortly after, spending their first year in Broomfield before purchasing a newly constructed home in Frederick's Windham Hill neighborhood. 2825 Saratoga Trail. 5 bedrooms. 4,177 square feet. The purchase price was $399,000. For a couple in their late 20s, it was a significant commitment, but it matched the life they appeared to be building together. Shanann threw herself into a new chapter. After years in traditional employment, she became an independent representative for Lavelle, a multi-level marketing company whose product line, called Thrive, consisted of wellness patches, capsules and shakes marketed around energy, weight management, and overall well-being. Lavelle's compensation model was built entirely on visibility. To succeed in it, you had to be present on social media every single day. You had to share your life publicly, make your results visible, and make the people watching want what you had. Shanann was exceptionally skilled at all of it. She posted every single day. Videos of herself speaking directly to the camera, relaxed, funny, and disarmingly honest. Photos of the girls. Posts about Chris. Updates on her health, her products, her family milestones. She documented pregnancies and school drop-offs and unremarkable Tuesday afternoons with the same energy she brought to everything else. Her Facebook page became a living, running archive of the Watts family. Hundreds of posts, a continuous record of a life that looked, from every available angle, like it was unfolding exactly the way it should. Friends who knew Shanann, and investigators who later worked through every entry in that digital record, described her in consistent terms. She was always reachable. She was always engaged. She returned calls. She responded to messages. She showed up. Not responding to her phone was not something Shanann did. It was so entirely outside her established pattern that when it happened on the morning of August 13th, the people who loved her knew within hours that something catastrophic had occurred. In June of 2018, Shanann posted a video she had clearly planned with care. She surprised Chris on camera with the news that she was pregnant again. His response was immediate. "That's awesome," he said. He smiled. The clip circulated widely. They were expecting a third child, a boy, they would later confirm. They had already chosen his name, Nichol Lee Watts. He was 15 weeks along, already named, already a presence in every conversation Shanann had with her friends, her followers, and her mother on the phone. That video still exists. Chris's face in it has been studied closely by a great many people in the years since August of 2018. Whether what he expressed in that moment was genuine, or whether it was already complicated by things happening behind the scenes that Shanann could not see, that is something only he could answer. And his answers, as investigators would come to understand, depended entirely on who was asking and what he stood to gain from the response. Now, let us talk about the girls. because this story does not fully exist without them. Bella Marie Watts was born on December 17, 2013. She was 4 years old when she died. The family called her Bells. Neighbors in Windham Hill described her as quiet and thoughtful, the kind of small child who absorbs the world carefully before she responds to it. She would wave at people from across the backyard with a deliberateness that made adults feel genuinely seen. 4 years old, and she had already developed a presence that people remembered long after a brief encounter. Celeste Catherine Watts, C.E., was born on July 17, 2015. She was 3 years old. Where Bella was measured and watchful, Sex was completely uncontained. She had what everyone who described her called a belly laugh, the kind that started deep and came out loud and filled every room it entered. She was, in the word that appears again and again in accounts of people who knew her, a firecracker. She ran at life without hesitation and without apology. 3 years old, and entirely, completely herself. CEC also had a significant nut allergy, serious enough that Shanann carried an EpiPen everywhere, without exception, every time they left the house together. The EpiPen was not a precaution carried occasionally. It was the difference between a reaction being manageable and a reaction becoming life-threatening. Which is precisely why, when Officer Coonrod found it sitting on the kitchen counter on the afternoon of August 13th, it registered the way it did. Wherever CT was, that EpiPen should have been with her. And then there was Nico, 15 weeks along. Already named. Already expected. A boy who had a name before he had a birthday. Who was being talked about in present and future tense by a mother who was still making plans, still building things, still entirely unaware of what had already been set in motion around her. The public image of the Watts family was confident, appealing, and relentlessly positive. The social media presence, the brand partnerships, the sponsored travel, the family videos. They constructed the portrait of a young couple who had faced genuine hardship and come through it together. But underneath that image sat a financial reality that bore no resemblance to the presentation. In June of 2015, Christopher and Shanann Watts filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The numbers in that filing were specific and a matter of public record. Their total reported debt at the time was $448,820. The mortgage on the Saratoga Trail home accounted for $378,000 of that. The remainder, approximately $70,000, came from credit card balances, student loans, and medical bills. Their combined savings across 2 bank accounts at the time of filing amounted to less than $10. The joint checking account held $864. In the year before the filing, their combined household income had been approximately $90,000. Chris earned around $61,500 at Anadarko. Shanann brought in the remainder through her work at Children's Hospital Colorado, where she had been a human resources specialist since 2013. The income was not unreasonable for a young family, but it could not sustain a $378,000 mortgage alongside monthly car payments and the accumulated weight of credit card spending that had been building for years. The math had simply stopped working, and the bankruptcy was the formal acknowledgement of that. What followed, on the surface, looked like a recovery. Shanann built her Lavelle business with determination and absolute consistency. She climbed through the company's incentive tiers, earned a Lexus through the brand's vehicle program, and posted about all-inclusive corporate trips to the Dominican Republic, to Mexico, to San Diego. She called herself a momtrepreneur and wore that word without apology, backing it up with documented, visible results. Friends of the couple, including Amanda and Nick Thayer, confirmed that the Watts had never hidden the bankruptcy. They had not been ashamed of it. They had framed it as a chapter that was behind them, one that the new business and the new direction had left in the past. Except that in July of 2018, while the marriage was silently collapsing and Chris was leading a double life, less than 40 miles from home, the Windham Hill Master Association filed a civil lawsuit against the Watts family for unpaid homeowners association dues. The amount was $1,533.80. Filed on July 12, 2018. A small number in isolation. But not isolated. It sat alongside a marriage under severe strain, and a household that was, in real terms, still financially stretched. The image Shanann had worked so hard to build, and had genuinely earned in many ways, was not a lie. But it was a version of the truth that left out everything that did not photograph well. The gap between what people saw online and what was actually happening inside that house was considerably wider than it appeared. And in the summer of 2018, it was getting wider every single week. Christopher Lee Watts was born on May 16, 1985, in Spring Lake, North Carolina. Before Anadarko, he had worked as a mechanic, practical hands-on work that suited his quiet and capable temperament. He was not a man who sought attention or demanded to be heard. He fixed things. He assisted when asked. He showed up, did the work, and went home. At Anadarko Petroleum, he had progressed from a rover position, which kept him outdoors at open field sites for most of the working day, to field coordinator, a promotion he received in early 2018. The new role moved him from outdoor work into the company's internal office environment, where he would spend more time around colleagues, more time in shared spaces. That shift in setting, as investigators would later come to understand, was directly connected to everything that followed. The people around him described Chris in the same terms, consistently and without variation. Passive, non-confrontational, easygoing. He was the kind of person who absorbed friction rather than generating it. If there was tension in a room, he stepped back. If there was a confrontation, he went silent. He did not argue. He did not escalate. Almost everyone who knew him reached for the same words. Shanann was the decision-maker in the household. She organized. She planned. She set the family's direction across most practical matters. Chris later told investigators that this dynamic had suited him, at first. He described himself as naturally laid back, someone who appreciated that she took the lead. It had worked, he said, in the beginning. But the people who observed the couple in the months leading up to August 13th told a different story than the one Chris presented to investigators. During the family's North Carolina visit in the summer of 2018, Shanann brought Chris and the girls to the hair salon where her mother Sandy worked. A co-worker at that salon named Danielle Search was present during the visit. Search later gave an interview to WRAL, in which she described Shanann walking into the room as like sunshine walking in. She said Chris was very standoffish, that he barely acknowledged anyone, that when she said hello to him directly, he kept his head down and did not respond. Search also said that Shanann's mother had confided in her that there were serious problems in the marriage and that separation had been discussed. This was not a second-hand impression formed from a distance. This was a brief, direct encounter that left a specific enough mark to be recalled and repeated to reporters days after the murders. And yet for years, the version that circulated publicly was the one from the Facebook page. Chris and Shanann, smiling on vacation. Chris, reacting with visible joy to the pregnancy announcement. Chris described by his wife in post after post as her rock, her best friend, the best father her girls could ask for. By mid-2018, something had fundamentally shifted in how Chris experienced the life he was living. He told investigators he had begun to feel like he could no longer be himself inside the marriage. He gave no specific example. He said only that he had been falling out of love, that it had been happening gradually, that he had started to feel the suffocating weight of a life that no longer felt like his own. What he did not disclose in those early conversations was what had actually been happening. He had not simply been drifting away from something. He had been moving deliberately towards someone else entirely. And that person had entered his life the moment a workplace promotion put them in the same building every morning. In the summer of 2018, Shanann took the girls to North Carolina for 6 weeks to visit her family. It was a longer trip than usual, and it left Chris alone in Frederick for most of it. During those weeks, Shanann began noticing things in her text exchanges with Chris that she could not explain away. The warmth felt thinner, the responses came slower, or not at all. The man on the other end of her messages felt distant in a way that was new and that she could not pin down precisely. On July 10th, she texted him directly. "You okay?" she wrote. "It's like you don't want to talk. I kept trying to talk, and I had to dig it out of you." His response: "I'm fine, baby. The last few days at work have put a lot of responsibility on me with new people. I didn't mean to seem short, boo. I love you to the moon and back." Read in isolation, that sounds like a reasonable explanation from a tired man. But Shanann had been with Chris for 8 years. She knew the difference between exhaustion and distance. What she was receiving from him was not the weight of a hard week at work. She ordered a book from Amazon called Hold Me Tight, a guide to emotional reconnection in relationships, the kind of book you purchase when you believe the relationship is still worth fighting for, and you are prepared to do the work. She had it shipped to the house on Saratoga Trail. When it arrived, Chris found it. He put it directly in the garbage without opening it. He did not mention it to her. He simply threw it away. Then, the night before Shanann left for the Arizona business trip in August, she sat down and wrote him a letter, handwritten, telling him how much she loved him and how much she wanted to repair what had broken between them. That letter was later found in the garbage too. Some of its pages had been torn away and were missing entirely. Shanann confided in close friends, including Amanda and Nick Thayer, who had known the couple for years. She told them what she was feeling. She told them she suspected Chris was having an affair. She said that if the marriage ended in divorce, she intended to fight for full custody of Bella and CEC. She was not in a panic. She was thinking ahead, with the precision that had always defined her, looking directly at a painful possibility, and making certain she knew what her next move would be if that possibility arrived. That statement about custody was made in private, inside a friendship, in a conversation Shanann had no reason to think would ever matter to anyone outside that room. But when investigators began reconstructing the timeline of events that led to August 13th, it was one of the details they returned to again and again. Because what Shanann had said, in passing, to people she trusted, spoke directly to the motive that the evidence was already beginning to form around. She had told her friends she would not make it easy for Chris to walk away from this family, that the girls would stay with her, that she would fight. She was fighting for her marriage and preparing for the possibility of losing it at the same time. She was ordering books and writing letters and confiding in friends and doing everything a person does when they still believe something salvageable is in front of them. What she did not know was that the man receiving those letters had already moved on, not just in his feelings, but in his planning. While she was writing love letters in the margins of a crumbling marriage, he was 40 miles away at an oil field working out what came next. And what came next had already been decided. By June of 2018, Christopher Watts had been married for nearly 6 years. He had 2 daughters, a 3rd child on the way, a 5-bedroom house in Frederick, and a wife who posted publicly every single day about how fortunate she was to have him. From the outside, the picture was exactly what it appeared to be. Inside the Anadarko Petroleum office in Platteville, Colorado, something else had already begun. Her name was Nichol Kessinger. She was 30 years old, a geologist and field engineer working for a company called Tasman Geosciences, which held a contract with Anadarko Petroleum. Her work involved environmental and geological coordination on Anadarko's oil and gas operations, which brought her into the company's office environment on a regular basis. She was not a direct Anadarko employee. She was a contractor, working alongside Anadarko staff through a third-party agreement. That is how she and Chris Watts ended up in the same building. Not because they worked for the same company in the traditional sense, but because her company's contract put her there, and his recent promotion had moved him inside. What the official record reflects, and what most coverage of this case has not examined with sufficient rigor, is that their contact may have begun earlier than either of them later admitted to investigators. A co-worker at Anadarko told police they had observed Chris and Kessinger interacting closely at the Platteville office as far back as March or April of 2018, months before either of them placed their first meeting. That detail was never officially resolved. Both Chris and Kessinger fixed the beginning of their acquaintance in late May or early June. The discrepancy sits in the case record, and was never adequately explained. What is confirmed is this. Somewhere in the ordinary flow of a working day in June of 2018, Chris walked into Kessinger's office to introduce himself. She found him attractive. She noticed immediately that he was not wearing a wedding ring. He did not mention his wife. He told her, eventually, that he had 2 daughters. She told investigators she thought that was kind of cute. They began talking. They started texting. From that point, the relationship accelerated. What Kessinger knew and what she was told are 2 things that do not entirely overlap, and the case record reflects both with uncomfortable clarity. She knew Chris had children. He had shown her photographs of Bella and Celeste early in their acquaintance. She also saw a photograph of Shanann on his phone's lock screen. She was aware, from a relatively early stage, that there was a wife. What Chris told her about that wife was that the marriage was effectively finished. He said they were separated. He said he was in the final stages of a divorce. He said he needed to find a new apartment for himself and his girls. He presented himself as a man who had already moved past his marriage and was simply completing the administrative process of making it official. Kessinger told investigators she took him at his word. She had no reason to independently verify the claim. He was, by her description, soft-spoken, a good listener, calm and easygoing, in a way she found genuine. She told the Denver Post in November of 2018, "When he spoke to me, he was very soft-spoken. He appeared to be a good listener. He made me believe he was doing all the things that a rational man and a good father would do." What she did not know, what she told investigators she only discovered after the family's disappearance made national headlines, was that Shanann was pregnant. Chris had never mentioned it. He had acknowledged the daughters, but erased the pregnancy entirely from the version of his life he presented to Kessinger. When he was eventually forced to address it in one of their later conversations, he told her the baby was not his. He suggested, with apparent calm, that Shanann had been involved with another man. He offered this as casually as someone correcting a minor misunderstanding. He was lying. Nichol Watts was his son. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with Chris's child, while Chris was building a relationship with a woman he had told the marriage was finished. In July, after flying briefly to North Carolina to join Shanann and the girls on their family visit, Chris called Kessinger and told her the divorce was finalized. That was also a lie. There had been no divorce filing. There had been no separation agreement. There had only been painful text exchanges in which Shanann kept reaching out to a man who was growing more unreachable by the day, and a husband who, by his own later admission, was not sleeping at home for the entire month of July. The dates they went on during those weeks were specific and documented in the case record. They went to a car museum in Boulder, their first official date in late June. They went to the Rooftop Tavern in Morrison. They went to bars and restaurants across the Denver area. They spent time at Kessinger's apartment and at hotels. They were seeing each other as frequently as 5 times a week through July. According to Kessinger's own account to investigators, the relationship became physical almost immediately after Shanann left for North Carolina with the girls. She described the early weeks as intense. On July 28th and 29th, they took an overnight trip to Great Sand Dunes National Park, a remote landscape of towering sand dunes in southern Colorado. They went sandboarding. Kessinger recorded a short video during the trip in which she thanked Chris for bringing her there and told him he meant a great deal to her. That video, along with over 100 photographs of Kessinger, some of them intimate in nature, was later recovered from Chris's phone. He had concealed all of it inside an application called Secret Calculator. The Secret Calculator was one of the most deliberately chosen tools Chris used throughout the affair. It was designed to appear, to anyone who glanced at his phone, as an ordinary functional calculator. There was nothing unusual about its icon, nothing that distinguished it from any standard application. But it was not a calculator. Behind the interface, accessible only by entering a 4-digit passcode, it functioned as a private vault, a messaging platform and media storage application completely invisible to anyone who did not already know it was there. Chris had installed it specifically for this purpose. He used it to store photographs and videos from the Great Sand Dunes trip, intimate images of Kessinger, text exchanges, and other communications he needed to keep entirely out of reach. The secret calculator was not a casual download made on impulse. It was infrastructure, the behavior of a man who had constructed a system because he was not planning to stop. Throughout the affair, Chris paid for their dates primarily using gift cards. Kessinger confirmed this to investigators, saying he always paid with those. Always. The practice was deliberate. Gift cards left no traceable charge on the joint bank account that Shanann monitored. Paying with gift cards meant no credit card alert, no line item on a statement, no record of a dinner for two where a dinner for one was expected. That pattern held for most of the summer, until August 11th. On the evening of August 11th, 2018, 2 nights before the murders, Chris took Kessinger to the Lazy Dog Sports Bar and Grill in Erie, Colorado. And this time, he did not pay with a gift card. He paid with a personal credit card linked to the shared Watts family bank account. The charge was over $60. Shanann, in Arizona for a work trip, received the account alert. She Googled the Lazy Dog menu that same day. This is documented on page 1919 of the official case discovery documents, trying to work out whether one meal or two had been purchased that evening. She did the arithmetic. She knew. That same evening in Arizona, Shanann told her friends about the charge over dinner. She told them the marriage was in serious trouble. It was, for many of the people present, one of the last conversations they would ever have with her. Kessinger told investigators that Chris switching from gift cards to the joint credit card that night felt significant to her, but she read it in the opposite direction entirely. She took it as a positive development in their relationship. She interpreted it as him no longer hiding himself, as a signal that he was moving openly toward her. She read it as progress. What she did not understand, and what the discovery documents make entirely clear, was that Shanann had been monitoring those accounts closely for weeks. She had seen the mounting evidence of a life her husband was living somewhere else. Chris knew she monitored those accounts. He told investigators himself that he believed Shanann would see the charge. He said he had stopped caring about concealing himself. He was not done hiding. He had simply decided he was done pretending to hide. The documented evidence of what both Chris and Kessinger were searching on their phones during this period adds another layer to a story that is already almost impossibly difficult to read clearly. On July 25th, Chris Googled, "When to say I love you for the first time in a new relationship." He then Googled, "How does it feel when someone tells you they love you?" His wife was 5 months pregnant. The child they had named Nico was growing in her body. And Chris Watts was on his phone, searching for the right moment to tell his girlfriend he loved her. Kessinger's own search history, recovered forensically after she attempted to delete it, tells a more complicated story about what she actually knew. On July 24th, she searched the phrase, "Man I'm having an affair with says he will leave his wife." She subsequently searched, "Marrying your mistress." On August 4th, at 12:45 in the morning, she spent over 2 hours searching for wedding dresses. These searches exist in the official case record. They were deleted from her phone and recovered by the forensic data technician. They do not prove she played any role in what happened to Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. Investigators examined them exhaustively and concluded she had no involvement in the murders. But they complicate the portrait of a woman who claimed she genuinely believed the divorce had already been finalized. The searches suggest she harbored doubts about the situation she was in, and that those doubts existed before August 13th. She was never charged with any crime. The investigation's conclusion on her involvement was unambiguous. She cooperated fully and completely. But her search history is part of the documented record, and an accurate account of this case requires that it be included. When news of Shanann's disappearance began circulating on the afternoon of August 13th, Kessinger saw the reports. She started pressing Chris. She asked him directly what he had done. She asked where his family was. He tried to deflect. He told her he would never harm his wife and kids. He told her everything would be fine. She kept pushing. It got to the point, she told investigators, where he was telling her so many lies that she told him she did not want to hear from him again until his family was found. His last text to her denied any wrongdoing. She told investigators, "I never said another word to him after that." The FaceTime call she had received from Chris earlier that morning had already given her something she could not rationalize away. When the call connected, she could see his bed in the background behind him. The mattress was completely bare. The sheets were gone. She asked him about it. He told her Shanann had taken them when she left. Kessinger told investigators she knew immediately that explanation made no sense. A woman who had walked out of her home in the middle of the night, without her car, without her phone, without her medication, without her children's car seats, had nonetheless taken the time to strip the bed and carry the sheets out with her. Kessinger said she knew it was wrong. What she did not yet know was what those sheets actually were. They were the same sheets Officer Coonrod had noted as missing during the welfare check that afternoon. They were the sheets that had been on the master bed when Shanann came home at 1:48 in the morning. They were the sheets that Chris had used to wrap his wife's body before loading her into his truck in the darkness. The bare mattress visible in the background of that FaceTime call was the crime scene, and Kessinger had looked directly at it without knowing what she was looking at. After ending her contact with Chris, Kessinger did not wait. She reached out to the Weld County Sheriff's Office herself. Before Chris had been arrested, before the bodies had been found, before the full scope of what had happened was publicly known. She walked into the investigation of her own accord and told them everything she knew. She sat through multiple police interviews. She was candid, emotional, and thorough. About an hour into her interview at the Thornton police station on August 16th, she broke down. Twice, in the span of 5 minutes, she told investigators, "It wasn't fair to his family for him to have an affair. It wasn't fair to me to have him lie to me and make me think that everything was going to plan. And still to this day, I don't even know what's a lie and what's not." What she provided gave investigators something they had been working toward since the welfare check on August 13th. Weld County District Attorney Michael Rourke later described her cooperation as bombshell information. She confirmed the full timeline of the affair, the documentation of their communication, the financial pattern of gift cards followed by the joint credit card, Chris's behavior on August the 13th, the stripped mattress visible during the FaceTime call, and the specific lies he had told her about his marriage and his family. She handed investigators the motive framework the case needed. She handed them the reason. Nichol Kessinger was never charged with any crime. She has not made any public statement since giving her interview to the Denver Post in November of 2018. She has not appeared publicly since. Reports suggest she legally changed her name and relocated, possibly entering some form of protected arrangement, though this has never been officially confirmed. As of early 2026, she has effectively disappeared from public life. Whatever she carried out of this case, she has carried it privately and without comment. From Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, in letters written years later and obtained by journalists, Chris Watts offered a radically different account of the relationship than the one he had given investigators. He described Kessinger as a harlot, a Jezebel. He wrote that her influence over him was the reason his family was dead. He wrote that she had pulled at him constantly, that she had held power over him, and that had it not been for her, his family would still be alive. In one letter he wrote that God had a plan for his life that involved suffering comparable to what Christ endured, and that his imprisonment was part of a divine purpose. These letters represent a complete and total reversal of everything Chris said during the investigation and during his Wisconsin confession in February of 2019. In that confession, he described Kessinger with warmth. He described the affair as his choice. He placed the agency for the relationship entirely on himself. He did not blame her then. The prison letters are the version produced by a man with no remaining legal consequences and no one in the room to push back. They are consistent with the pattern investigators documented throughout the entire case. Every single time Chris Watts needed an explanation for what he had done, he found someone else to point toward. He blamed Shanann in the interrogation room. He blamed the marriage in his early interviews. He blamed Kessinger in the letters he wrote from his cell. The affair with Nichol Kessinger was not the cause of what happened to Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. It was the environment in which a man who had already made his decision began calculating what it would take to execute it. Investigators had the affair, they had the motive. They had Kessinger's testimony, her documentation, and her account of a man who had spent weeks constructing a version of his life that erased his pregnant wife and 2 daughters as though they were a draft he no longer needed. What they did not yet fully understand was how far back the planning had actually gone, and how much darker it was than the affair alone had suggested. There is a version of this case that most people carry, a version in which a marriage fell apart, an affair developed, pressure built across months, and then one August night something finally snapped. A man at a breaking point. A confrontation that spiraled beyond control. A tragedy born from a single, terrible moment. That version is wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not a matter of emphasis or interpretation. The evidence? The official 2,000-page case discovery record released by the Weld County District Attorney, the toxicology findings from Shanann's autopsy, and the written admissions Chris Watts made in letters from his prison cell, all point in a single, unambiguous direction. What happened to Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico was not the product of one night's collision between 2 people in a failing marriage. It was the end point of a plan. A plan that had been running, in some form, for weeks before August 13th ever arrived. Shanann Cadell was a 65-year-old author and Christian writer who, by her own account, felt called to reach out to Christopher Watts after following his case in the news. In February of 2019, just months after his sentencing, she wrote him a letter at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. She was direct in that first letter. She told him she was not writing to praise him or to be his pen pal. She wanted to write a book about his story. He wrote back. After several exchanges, Chris added Cadell to his approved visitors list. She visited him in person. During that visit, he told her he wanted to give her his confessions in writing rather than verbally, because he believed their in-person conversations were being recorded by the prison. Over the months that followed, the 2 exchanged close to 100 phone calls and thousands of words in handwritten letters. Cadell used that correspondence to write a book titled Letters from Christopher, The Tragic Confessions of the Watts Family Murders, published by Dorrance Publishing in September of 2019, 13 months after the murders. The book contains admissions that Chris Watts had never made to law enforcement, to the FBI, to the court, or in any formal investigative context. They are self-reported statements from a convicted killer to a pen pal. They are not sworn testimony. They are not independently verified in every detail. But several of the most significant admissions in those letters are directly corroborated by the official forensic record, and all of them are consistent with the picture that the official evidence had already been constructing. What Chris told Shanann Cadell begins with a statement that reframes everything that followed. He had been thinking about killing his family for weeks. That is not a paraphrase. That is the substance of what he wrote. He described spending weeks with the knowledge of what he was going to do living inside his mind. He described it not as an impulse or an eruption of rage, but as something that had been present for a significant stretch of time before August 13th arrived. And then he wrote about the night of August 12th. August 12th, 2018, was the night before the murders. That evening, Chris took Bella and Celeste to a neighborhood birthday party. They played with water balloons. They sang songs in the car on the way home. He gave them a bath, made dinner, read them bedtime stories, and sang them their bedtime songs. He tucked them in. He kissed them goodnight. And then he walked out of their rooms. In his letter to Cadell, he described what he thought as he walked away from his daughter's beds that night. He wrote, August 12th, when I finished putting the girls to bed, I walked away and said, that's the last time I'm going to be tucking my babies in. I knew what was going to happen the day before, and I did nothing to stop it. I was numb to the entire world. I had literally taken my kids to a birthday party, played with water balloons, had an amazing time, sung songs all the way home, given them a bath, eaten dinner, read bedtime stories and sung bedtime songs, and still nothing registered. He knew on the night of August 12th what he intended to do before the next morning was finished. He had spent an ordinary evening with his daughters, laughing, singing, playing, and walked away from their beds knowing it was the last time he would ever do it. And he did nothing to stop what he had already decided. That is premeditation, in his own words, written by his own hand, from his prison cell, to a woman he had chosen to trust with what he called his confession. The Cadle letters also contain a disclosure about something that had occurred weeks before August 13th, something that had been sitting in the forensic record without a full explanation until Chris himself provided one. When the Weld County coroner completed Shanann's autopsy, the toxicology screen returned a finding that investigators noted but could not immediately account for. Oxycodone, a potent prescription painkiller, was present in Shanann's system at the time of her death. Shanann did not have a prescription for oxycodone. There was no documented medical reason for it to be in her body. The finding sat in the official record as an unexplained data point. Chris Watts explained it in his letter to Cadle. He wrote, "The reason the medical examiner found oxycodone in Shanann's system is because I gave it to her." He wrote that he had been slipping it into her drinks without her knowledge. He explained his reasoning plainly. He thought it would be easier to be with Nichol if Shanann was no longer pregnant. He said he had never wanted that baby. He believed that administering oxycodone in a sufficient dose might cause Shanann to miscarry. He wrote that he tried to poison her with a large dose of it, because what he wanted was for her to lose the pregnancy. The attempt failed. Shanann became visibly ill. People around her noticed she was unwell during that stretch of the summer. But she remained pregnant. Nico survived whatever had been placed in her system. And Chris, rather than stepping back from the trajectory he was on, adjusted and continued moving forward. He had also, according to Cadle, added Nichol Kessinger to his phone contacts in June of 2018 under a false name, a specific, deliberate act of concealment that had been in place from the very first days of the affair. The secret calculator application, the fake contact name, the gift cards, the oxycodone in the drinks. This was not improvisation. It was infrastructure. It was the behavior of a man who had been thinking carefully about concealment and about outcomes for a very long time. The official case discovery files, 2,000 pages released by the Weld County District Attorney after sentencing, then provide the next documented layer. At 8:26 in the morning on August 13th, after driving 40 miles to Servi 319, after burying Shanann in a shallow grave near the oil tank battery, and before anyone in Frederick had any reason to believe anything was wrong, Chris Watts Googled the phone number for Primrose School and called the school to inform them that Bella and Celeste would no longer be attending. He gave no reason. He simply delivered the information and ended the call. At 8:28, 2 minutes later, he called his real estate agent and began the process of listing the family home for sale. 2 calls, back to back, made while his pregnant wife's body was in the ground 40 miles away, and his daughters had already been submerged in crude oil storage tanks. There was no grief in those calls, no hesitation, no trace of a man struggling under the weight of what he had done in the dark hours before sunrise. There was scheduling, there was logistics, there was the calm, methodical work of a man who had already moved into the next chapter of his life before the current one had been publicly closed. This is not what a person sounds like when they have snapped. The motive, as Weld County District Attorney Michael Rourke articulated it publicly after the case closed, was not subtle. Rourke stated that the evidence showed Chris Watts had every intention of starting a brand new life, his exact phrase, free of Shanann and Bella and Celeste and Nico, with the love of his life, as Chris himself had described Kessinger. A brand new life, clean. That is not the language of a crime, of passion. That is the language of someone who had thought carefully about what he wanted on the other side of all of this, and had concluded that the only viable path to it required removing the people standing in his way. The obstacles were specific. Shanann had told her friends she would fight for full custody of Bella and CEC if the marriage ended. She had said it plainly, with absolute intention. A separation or divorce would not have given Chris the clean break he was evidently seeking. It would have given him years of court proceedings, custody arrangements, financial obligations, and permanent connection to a life and a woman he was trying to leave. The pregnancy with Nico added another 18 years of entanglement to that calculation. A third child made a clean break mathematically impossible through any legal route. In the Cadle letters, Chris also wrote something that speaks directly to how he experienced the decision in real time. He wrote that all the weeks of me thinking about killing her, and now I was faced with it. That sentence is not the language of impulse. It is the language of someone who had lived with an intention long enough that when the moment arrived, it felt familiar rather than sudden. The sequence of what happened on the morning of August 13th and on the night before it is now documented across multiple verified sources and the official forensic record. On the evening of August 12th, Chris tucked his daughters into bed, knowing what he intended to do before morning arrived. He was numb to the entire world, as he put it, while singing them their bedtime songs. In the early hours of August 13th, before Shanann arrived home, Chris went to the girls' rooms. He went to Bella's room first, then Celeste's room, and used a pillow from each of their beds. That is what he told Cadel. The medical examiner's determination of cause of death for both girls, smothering, is consistent with this account. He believed both girls were dead when he left their rooms and returned to the master bedroom. He then got back into bed and waited for his wife to come home. Shanann walked through the front door at 1:48 in the morning. What happened in the bedroom between the two of them, the conversation, the confrontation, the strangling, belongs to the next chapter of this story. Because that is where the investigation begins, and that is where the people who would spend the next 40 to 8 hours dismantling everything described in this chapter would first begin to understand what they were looking at. What this chapter establishes, from the official record and from the letters Chris wrote in his own hand, is that none of it began on the morning of August 13th. The plan had been running for weeks. The oxycodone had already been administered. The girls' school had been mentally cancelled before the call was ever made. The realtor had already been identified. The next property had already been considered. The fake contact name had already been created. The secret calculator had already been loaded. August 13th was not where this started. It was where it finished. Shanann Watts landed back in Colorado late on the night of August 12th, after several days in Scottsdale, Arizona, attending a business conference with Lavelle. The trip had not gone smoothly on an emotional level. On the final evening in Arizona, Shanann had dinner with a group of her closest friends and colleagues, including Nichol Atkinson. She talked about her marriage. She talked about the $60 dinner charge she had seen flagged on the joint bank account, the one from the Lazy Dog Sports Bar and Grill that she had looked up line by line, trying to establish whether her husband had been eating alone or with someone. She told her friends that things between her and Chris were serious. That she was worried, that something felt wrong in a way she could not fully articulate, but could not dismiss either. That dinner in Arizona was the last time most of those women would ever see Shanann Watts. Her flight home was delayed by a storm. She arrived later than planned. Nichol Atkinson drove her from the airport to the house on Saratoga Trail. They pulled up to the property in the early hours of August 13th, 2018. What recorded Shanann's arrival was the Vivint doorbell camera mounted on the front of the Watts home. That camera captured her walking toward her own front door at 1:48 in the morning, carrying a suitcase and her purse, 15 weeks pregnant, returning from a work trip to a house where her husband was waiting. She walked through the door. The camera recorded it. The timestamp was confirmed at 1:48. Weld County District Attorney Michael Rourke later told reporters that the Vivint doorbell footage was the last known recorded image of Shanann Watts alive. Nichol waited until the door closed. Then, she drove home. Inside the house, the girls were asleep in their rooms, and Chris was awake. According to his own later admissions in the Cadel letters and in the Wisconsin prison confession, he had been waiting for her to arrive. Chris told Shanann he did not love her anymore. He told her he wanted out of the marriage. Shanann, exhausted from a cross-country flight and 15 weeks pregnant, told him that if he left, he would never see the children again. According to Chris's own account, that statement about the children was the immediate trigger for what he did next. He strangled Shanann in the bedroom while she was on the bed. He later described it in clinical terms in the Cadel letters, writing about squeezing the jugular veins, about her face, about her eyes. He wrote that all the weeks of thinking about killing her had now arrived at their conclusion. He described knowing, as he held his hands around her throat, that if he let go, she would still take Kessinger from him. He wrote that her eyes filled. He wrote that he knew she was gone when she relieved herself. Bella came into the room. She had woken up and walked in. What she found, her mother on the bed, her father standing in the room, is something Chris described in the Cadle letters with a detail that investigators said stayed with every person who read it. Both Bella and Celeste came in while he was wrapping Shanann's body in the top sheet from the master bed. They asked what was wrong with Mommy. He told them she was not feeling well. Bella began to cry. Celeste started whimpering. He described feeling so mad that they were still alive. He wrapped Shanann in that bedsheet, the only item that would later be conspicuously absent from an otherwise immaculate house, and tried to carry her toward the garage. She was too heavy. He lost his grip on the stairs. He dragged her the rest of the way down. He then bundled her into the back of his truck, covering her face and feet with garbage bags so that his daughters, who would be in the back seat on the drive to the oil field, would not have to look directly at their mother's face. Bella and Celeste were alive when they left that house. They were in the back seat of their father's truck. What happened to them at Survey 319 is covered in the chapter where it belongs in the full sequence of this story. What this chapter is concerned with is what the outside world was observing while all of this was unfolding. And what the outside world was seeing for the first several hours of August 13th was nothing at all. Just after 5 in the morning, a motion sensor across the street activated. Nathaniel Trinastish lived directly opposite the Watts home. His security camera, mounted on the front of his house and aimed at the street and at the Watts property, detected motion at approximately 5:27 in the morning and began recording. What it captured over the minutes that followed has since been viewed by millions of people around the world. The footage showed Chris Watts reversing his truck into his own garage, not pulling up to the street the way he did every other morning, but backing the vehicle inside so that the truck bed was enclosed within the garage space and the door could come down behind it. Every neighbor later asked about this noted the same thing. He never parked that way. The truck always went on the street. On the morning of August 13th, it went into the garage. Over the minutes that followed, the camera recorded Chris making multiple trips between the garage and the truck. Back and forth. Back and forth. The footage was shot at a distance, an angle that made it difficult to see precisely what was happening on the driver's side. In one portion of the footage, he appeared to be walking backwards toward the truck, a movement that investigators and analysts later noted was consistent with dragging rather than carrying. Then, the camera captured something specific, visible, even at that distance, and at that angle. Chris loaded a red gas can into the bed of his pickup truck. That red gas can appears in the footage. It was documented in the evidence released by the Weld County District Attorney's Office on November 20 to 9th of 2018, when the security camera footage was made public. It was reported by ABC News, CBS News, and confirmed in the case discovery materials. Chris's stated explanation for his movements that morning was that he was loading work tools and equipment. The gas can, visible, specific, documented, was part of what the camera caught him placing into that truck before sunrise on the morning his family disappeared. At approximately 5:46 in the morning, according to the Geotab GPS telematics data recovered from his work truck, Chris turned on the headlights. The truck backed out of the driveway and turned left, heading out of the neighborhood in the direction of Survey 319, 40 miles north. The camera recorded nothing else from the Watts house between 1:48 and 5:46 that morning. No other vehicle arrived. No one else left. There was no friend who came to collect Shanann and the girls. There was no car with headlights moving through the frame in the direction of any alternative explanation. The house sat quiet and dark. The only person the camera recorded leaving it was Christopher Watts. There was also a baby monitor. Dia Rourke confirmed to CBS News that a baby monitor with video capability was present in at least one of the girls' bedrooms in the Watts home. Its existence is noted in the official case materials without elaboration, but its presence in the house that morning adds a dimension to the documented environment of those early hours that investigators found deeply significant. When the endangered missing alert went out that afternoon, and Nathan Trinastich heard that his neighbors were missing, he came forward immediately. He told investigators he had footage from that morning. He offered to show it to them. What followed was captured on Officer Coonrod's body camera. Trinastich sat down with investigators in his living room and played back the security camera footage on his television. Chris Watts was in the room. He stood near the screen while the recording played. And what the investigators watching him noted, and what the body camera footage later confirmed when it was publicly released, was that Chris was not watching it the way a man watches footage when he is desperate to find evidence of where his missing family might have gone. He glanced at the screen. He looked at his phone. He looked away. He looked back. He never leaned forward. He never asked to pause the footage or rewind it. His eyes were not fixed on that recording, with the urgency of a father searching for any trace of where his wife and daughters could be. He only spoke when the footage showed something he felt he needed to address. And what he needed to address, both times he spoke with emphasis, was the absence of other vehicles. No cars came through, he said. See? No headlights. He was not pointing out what the camera had caught. He was pointing out what it had not caught, in a way that served the version of events he had already delivered to Officer Coonrod. After Chris left the room, Trinastich turned to the officer and said what he had been thinking since the welfare check began. He told the officer he did not understand why Chris kept explaining himself over and over. He said Chris did not look worried. He said he looked like he was trying to cover his tracks. That statement was made by Nathaniel Trinastich on body camera footage on the afternoon of August 13, 2018, before the polygraph, before the formal interrogation, before any arrest had been made. A neighbor who had lived across the street from this family for years had watched Chris for less than an hour that afternoon, and arrived at a conclusion that the entire investigative apparatus would spend the next 40 to 8 hours building toward with forensic evidence. On the afternoon of August 14th, less than 36 hours after Shanann had been reported missing, Christopher Watts stood outside his home on Saratoga Trail and gave a live televised interview to reporter Tomas Hoppo of Denver 7, the local ABC affiliate, KMGH-TV. A second local station, KUSA-TV, also broadcast portions of it. He wore a blue shirt. He stood straight. He spoke in measured, even sentences. He said he wanted his family home. He said the house was not complete without them. He addressed his wife and daughters by name and asked them to come back. And then he said something no one had prompted him to say. Without being asked, without the subject being raised by the reporter, Chris mentioned that he and Shanann had had an emotional conversation before she went missing. He said it was not quite an argument. He said he would leave it at that. He offered the information and then declined to elaborate on it. What he said next, captured verbatim in the Denver 7 interview transcript at approximately the 5-minute mark, was this: "I just want them back." And then, immediately, visibly, he smiled. He laughed. The transcript records both. In the same breath in which he said he wanted his missing pregnant wife and daughters home, his face produced the opposite of grief. Body language expert Dr. Cliff Lansley, analyzing the footage for the Discovery Plus documentary Chris Watts, A Faking It Special, documented what he observed in clinical terms. When Chris said, "I just want them back," referring specifically to his children, Lansley noted that the lip corners rose, the eyes tightened, and the cheeks lifted, a combination he identified as an indicator of genuine pleasure. Not grief. Not desperation. Pleasure. Lansley also noted that in the same moment, Chris slung out his left hand in what Lansley described as a hand shrug, rotating anti-clockwise, then closed his eyes for a full second and shook his head no, while the words he was saying would have aligned with a yes response. Lansley described this as a cluster of 4 simultaneous behaviors, indicating that there was nothing in that statement Chris had any confidence in, because it was not true. Dawn Archer, a professor of linguistics at Manchester Metropolitan University, who also analysed the interview, noted that the speech pattern throughout was focused almost entirely on Chris himself, his feelings, his apparent distress, rather than on his wife or daughters. There was no matching affect in his voice, she said. The words described despair. The voice carried none of it. Former FBI profiler Candice DeLong, who was among the analysts who examined the Watts case publicly on the Dr. Phil program, in December of 2018, alongside former prosecutor Nancy Grace, law enforcement consultant Steve Cardian, And body language expert Susan Constantine noted that cases of this type, which behavioral analysts call family annihilation, are uncommon precisely because annihilators who kill their entire family almost always take their own lives afterward. Chris did not. He gave a television interview. He asked the public for help. He performed the role of a devastated husband in front of a camera with his family already dead. And he performed it with a composure that D. Long and every other analyst who examined the footage found deeply and irreconcilably inconsistent with genuine parental grief. What the interview did not contain was also noted. Chris generated no leads. He did not suggest search areas investigators had not already identified. He did not ask what was being done to expand the effort. He did not demand action. He answered the questions put to him, said the words the situation called for, and returned to a steady baseline between sentences. He was not unraveling. He was not desperate. He was managing. FBI Special Agent Graham Coder had been brought into the investigation to assist Frederick Police and the CBI. He was watching the broadcast with the investigative team when it aired. When the interview ended, his assessment was immediate. He told the group they needed Chris Watts in a room. Recorded right now. Not the next day. The next morning. The next morning, August 15th, Christopher Watts drove to the Frederick Police Department. He brought his father, Ronnie Watts, who had flown in overnight from Spring Lake, North Carolina. Chris walked through the front door of that building and told investigators he had nothing to hide. He said he was ready to take a polygraph examination. He was cooperative. He was composed. He appeared confident. He did not know that Special Agent Graham Coder of the FBI and Agent Tammy Lee of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation had spent the entire previous night going through his phone. They had found the secret calculator application. They had found Nichol Kessinger's contact listed under a false name. They had found the months of messages, the photographs from the Great Sand Dunes trip, the records of the overnight stays, and the full documentary history of a relationship he had denied to Officer Coonrod, denied to Nicole Atkinson, denied in his television interview, and was about to deny again in a formal law enforcement setting to the two people in that building who already knew every detail of it. Christopher Watts walked into the Frederick Police Department on the morning of August 15th, thinking he was continuing to manage a story. He was walking into the end of one. Ronnie Watts was 62 years old. He had flown across the country overnight after learning that his son's pregnant wife and two granddaughters were missing and that law enforcement was involved. He had arrived not knowing what investigators already believed. He had come because his son had called, and because whatever was happening in Frederick, Colorado, he intended to be present for it. When they walked through the front door together, investigators separated them immediately. Ronnie was taken to a waiting area. He remained there for hours, never leaving the building, while Chris was brought in and introduced to Special Agent Graham Coder of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Coder was soft-spoken. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean across the table or open with accusations. He built. He was patient in the way that genuinely skilled investigators are patient, not passively, but with precise direction. Every question was placed in sequence for a deliberate reason. The conversation moved at his pace. He would later be quoted as telling Chris directly at one point, "We are going to be looking for the man who did this, and you can imagine that we are going to include you as that man." He said it in the same measured, almost conversational tone he maintained throughout. Soft, soothing, as Agent Lee would later describe it, and, at the same time, asking very, very tough questions. The first thing Agent Coder did was ask Chris to write a statement. Before any verbal questioning began, he had Chris sit down and write a full detailed account of what had happened from the time Shanann arrived home on the night of August 12th through the time Chris left for work on the morning of August 13th. The written statement technique is a standard investigative tool used specifically because it locks a version of events into the permanent record before any probing begins. Once a subject commits details to paper in their own handwriting, that version becomes the fixed reference point for everything that follows. Every detail they write is one they will be held to. Every gap is a gap that can be pressed. Chris wrote his statement. When he finished, The version on paper read as follows. Shanann arrived home from her trip at approximately 2 in the morning. They went to bed. At 4 in the morning, his alarm went off for work. The couple had an emotional conversation about the state of their marriage. He said they discussed separating. He said they discussed listing the house for sale. At the end of the conversation, he said, Shanann told him she was going to take the girls to a friend's house and would be back later in the day. He said he left for work at around 5:15 in the morning. He said she was still in bed when he left. The girls were in their rooms. That was the last he saw any of them. And despite texting and calling Shanann multiple times throughout the day, he had not heard from her since. He wrote that down. He signed it. He handed it to Agent Coda. And then the verbal questioning began. Agent Coda worked through Chris's account methodically. He asked about the marriage, about the separation conversation, about what had specifically been said, and how long the difficulties had been building. He asked about the girls, their routines, their friendships, where Shanann typically took them. He asked about the text messages and phone calls Chris said he had made throughout August 13th without receiving any response. At a certain point, Agent Coda raised the subject of infidelity. He asked Chris whether he had been having an affair. Chris said no. He said he had never cheated on Shanann in his life. He said he was certain Shanann had never been unfaithful to him either. He said the two of them had a mutual agreement that if either of them ever found themselves considering something outside the marriage, they would tell the other one first, before anything happened. He described this as a foundational element of their relationship. He said this agreement had never been tested because neither of them had ever wanted anyone else. He delivered this denial directly, without visible hesitation, without any shift in his composure. He looked at Agent Coda and told him, in a formal recorded law enforcement interview with his missing pregnant wife's case open between them, that he was a faithful husband and that infidelity played no part in any of this. In another part of the building, at approximately the same time, something had already happened that made every word of that denial irrelevant. At 8 o'clock that morning, 3 hours before the polygraph examination was scheduled to begin, Agent Tammy Lee received a phone call. The caller was Tony Husky, Anadarko's regional security manager. Husky told Agent Lee that he had been reviewing Christopher Watts's computer network traffic and had found something significant. There were emails between Chris and an Anadarko contracted employee. He identified her as Nichol Kessinger, age 30, born July 3, 1988, and said she worked on the geosciences side of the company. Husky said the email suggested Chris had been in a relationship with her. That phone call, made at 8 in the morning on August 15th, was the moment the affair formally entered the official investigation. Not from phone forensics alone, from Anadarko's own security manager, calling in voluntarily, 3 hours before the man at the center of it was scheduled to sit down and tell investigators he had never been unfaithful. From there, investigators moved rapidly. The secret calculator application was located on Chris's phone. When the 4-digit passcode was entered, what the application contained was a complete documentary record. Text messages between Chris and Kessinger spanning months, photographs, images from overnight trips, including the Great Sand Dunes trip, images Chris had taken himself, identifiable because his own reflection appeared in certain frames, love letters, phone logs, records of sustained, deliberate communication maintained across more than 2 months. Beyond the secret calculator, the forensic review found the contact entry for Kessinger registered under a false name. Not her real identity, but a fabricated name Chris had created specifically so her name would not appear if Shanann happened to see his screen. They found records of the Lazy Dog dinner charge on August 11th. They found months of communication. The affair was confirmed in its entirety. The motive was established. The lie Chris was delivering in the interview room down the hall was being documented in real time by the evidence already sitting in front of the investigative team. They made a deliberate decision not to tell Chris any of this yet. They let him keep talking. Every detail he volunteered, every denial he offered, every version of events he constructed, was being measured against what Tony Husky had reported that morning and what the phone forensics had confirmed in the hours since. Agent Coda kept his voice steady, his manner open, and the conversation moving. As the interview continued, Investigators monitoring the session documented a series of behavioral details preserved in the official case record. At one point, when discussing his daughters and the things they loved, Chris referred to Bella and Celeste in the past tense. Not as an isolated slip, attributable to fatigue or nerves, but in a pattern. He was shown photographs of the girls, and when he described what he saw, he reached for the language of memory. She always loved those shoes, he said. The wrong tense. The tense of a man for whom those children were already past. Agent Lee, who had observed the FBI interview before conducting her polygraph examination, noted this specifically. Coda had shown Chris a printed photograph of Bella and Celeste, and the behavioral response was immediate. Past tense. The language of someone for whom those children were not coming home. At no point during the hours he spent with Agent Coda did Chris generate a single lead. He did not suggest any search areas investigators had not already identified. He did not ask what was being done to find his family. He did not propose any new avenue of inquiry, or volunteer anything that was not directly solicited. He answered what was asked. He offered nothing beyond it. He was not the kind of person investigators typically encountered in missing persons cases where the spouse was uninvolved, the kind who cannot sit still, who demands to know what action is being taken, who pushes relentlessly because the alternative is unbearable. Chris was comfortable waiting. And then there was the list. Agent Lee, in the final portion of the pre-polygraph interview, asked Chris to explain all the ways a person could physically make someone disappear. This is a recognized investigative technique used specifically to observe which scenarios produce a reaction and how a subject responds to having the full range of possibilities made explicit in front of them. Chris mentioned hiring someone. A hitman, he said. I'm just being honest. Then Agent Lee gave him more room. She asked him to list the physical ways a person could cause someone else's disappearance through murder. Chris replied, stab someone, shoot someone, hit them with a blunt object. Then he paused. What else is there? He said. I mean, use a weapon like a gun or a knife. Agent Lee added, you could smother someone. You could strangle someone. Chris said, you could hang someone, yeah. All that kind of things. I mean, it's hard to even think about that kind of stuff right now. And then, as the official CBI polygraph report documents in Agent Lee's own words, at that point, Chris giggled and told me it was a hard question to answer, because he had nothing to do with the disappearance. A giggle. From a man whose pregnant wife and 2 daughters had been missing for 2 days, presented with a list of ways a person could be murdered and made to disappear. He giggled, and described it as hard to think about. Agent Lee recorded it. It went into the official case file. It was later confirmed in the 2,000 pages of discovery documents released by the Weld County District Attorney and reported by Oxygen from those documents. The giggle is not interpretation or analysis. It is documented in the agent's own written account of what happened in that room. After the discussion of possible methods of killing, Agent Lee said to Chris that sometimes people feel guilty for causing someone to leave for the conversation that might have pushed them out the door. That's why I feel like a jackass right now, Chris replied. The formal polygraph examination was scheduled for 11 in the morning on August 15th. When it began, Agent Lee walked Chris through the procedure, how the equipment worked, what was being measured, what the comparison questions were for, and what the process would look like from his perspective. She then read Chris his Miranda rights. He signed an advisement of rights form and a consent form indicating his willingness to undergo the examination. Before attaching the instruments, Agent Lee addressed the subject of the affair one final time. She asked Chris whether he had been involved with anyone outside his marriage. He denied it. For the second formal time in less than 24 hours, Christopher Watts looked at a law enforcement investigator and told them he had never been unfaithful. He said this, knowing what was on his phone. He said this knowing what Tony Husky had already reported 3 hours earlier that morning. He said it, sitting in a chair, about to be connected to a polygraph machine. Agent Lee noted his denial. Then she said something to him directly. She told him it would be extremely foolish for someone who had anything to do with their family's disappearance to come in and take this polygraph today. She said it plainly, as a statement of fact. She was giving him a door. She was making the choice explicit. If you did something to your family, "Do not take this test." Christopher Watts did not get up. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not ask for time to think. He sat in the chair and waited for the examination to begin. The formal polygraph examination consisted of 3 relevant questions. Did you physically cause Shanann's disappearance? Do you know where Shanann is now? Are you lying about the last time you saw her? Chris answered no to all 3. His voice was steady. He did not visibly hesitate between questions. He gave his answers in the calm, controlled manner he had maintained across 2 days of formal law enforcement contact. Agent Lee administered the examination, then removed the instruments from the room. She took the charts to a separate space to grade them using the empirical scoring system, the standard methodology used by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for polygraph analysis. The threshold for a truthful result in this scoring system is a positive score of 2 or higher. The threshold for deception indicated is a -4 or below. She worked through each chart collection methodically. Chris Watts scored a -18, not a -4, not a -8, a -18 on every question across every chart collection. The analysis of the official CBI report describes a -18 as extraordinarily far beyond the deception threshold, indicating massive and consistent physiological reactions across all relevant questions. The official CBI polygraph report classified the result as deception indicated, the strongest possible negative finding available on a polygraph examination. Polygraph results are not admissible as evidence in Colorado courts. They are an investigative tool. A -18 did not prove Christopher Watts had killed his family. What it told the investigative team, in the clearest possible terms, was that the man who had just sat in that chair had not told the truth about any of the 3 most important questions they had asked him. It also, formally, changed his status. From this moment, Christopher Watts was no longer being treated as a cooperative witness in a missing persons case. He was the primary suspect in what investigators now believed was a homicide investigation. While Agent Lee was grading the charts in another room, Chris sat alone in the interview room. He had the space to himself for a stretch of time. And what he did with that time was documented. He watched videos on his phone. Videos of his daughters, Bella and Celeste, giggling and playing. He sat in the interview room of the Frederick Police Department, having just failed a polygraph test on questions about whether he knew where his family was, and he watched footage of his daughters on his phone screen. Agent Lee completed her grading. She walked to where Agent Coda was waiting. They agreed on what came next. They walked back into the interview room together. They brought with them a printed photograph of Bella and Celeste, which they placed on the table directly in front of Chris. Agent Lee told him it was clear he had not been honest during the testing. She told him he had not passed the polygraph. Agent Coda told him that he had failed miserably on the questions about where his wife and children were. Chris claimed he was a nervous person and felt like he would say the wrong thing on every question. Coda and Lee told him that the affair had not been one of the polygraph questions. His secret life could not have been the thing he was nervous about, because it had not been asked. The deception indicated on the charts was about Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, about where they were, about what he knew. Chris said, "I didn't lie to you on that polygraph, I promise." Agent Coda told him to stop. He asked him to take a deep breath. Then Coda reminded Chris that infidelity had not been one of the polygraph questions. He then told Chris directly that they already knew about his girlfriend Nikki. They named Nichol Kessinger. They did not ask whether the relationship existed. They told him they knew it did. The room was no longer the same room. Everything that Chris had constructed across 2 days, the cooperative witness, the confused husband, the faithful man with no idea where his family had gone, was no longer standing. What was left was a man sitting across a table from 2 investigators who had a -18 polygraph score, a phone full of documented evidence, a tip from Anadarko's own security manager, and a printed photograph of 2 little girls placed face up on the table between them. Chris Watts sat across from all of it, and the conversation that followed would change everything. When they had first entered the building on August 15th, the approach had been calibrated precisely: keep Chris talking, keep him cooperative, give him no indication of how far ahead the investigation already was. Agent Coda had been patient and measured. The conversation had moved at his pace. The instruments had been attached, the test had been administered, and then the agents had left the room and allowed the charts to tell them what they already suspected. Now they were back, and the atmosphere they carried in with them was different. The warmth was gone. What replaced it was not hostility, that would have been counterproductive, and both of them knew it. What replaced it was precision, a focused, directed clarity that communicated to the man sitting across the table that the phase of this conversation devoted to rapport building was finished. What came next was the only part that had ever mattered. Agent Coda and Agent Lee employed a method known as minimization, a documented, established approach used in investigative interviewing when a subject is resistant to full disclosure and requires a psychological pathway into it. The technique involves offering the suspect reduced culpability framings for what may have occurred, alternative explanations, suggested justifications, the possibility that a reasonable person in a desperate situation could have reached a breaking point that others might understand, even if they could not condone it. Coda suggested that the marriage may have been one-sided for years, that someone in Chris's position, feeling trapped, feeling unheard, carrying the weight of obligation and expectation, might have reached a point that other people could relate to on some level. He raised the possibility that something could have happened that morning that had not been planned, that maybe Chris had walked in on something, that maybe Shanann had done something to the girls, and he had simply reacted. This was not investigators believing any of that. It was not investigators suggesting that Shanann bore any responsibility whatsoever for what had happened in that house. It was a strategic communication technique designed to accomplish one specific objective: lower Chris's psychological defenses enough to get him talking about the actual events. The goal was not agreement. The goal was disclosure. Chris responded to the framing. He began to suggest that Shanann had harmed the girls, that he had walked in on her doing something to Celeste, that he had reacted to something unimaginable, that what followed was the action of a man responding to horror. He was constructing a false narrative in real time, assembling a version of events in which Shanann was the initiator of violence and he was the reactor, in which the woman who could no longer speak was assigned the action that had set everything in motion. Investigators recognized the construction. They had seen it before. They did not challenge it directly. They let him build it, knowing that the autopsy findings would demolish it completely when the time came. And then Chris made the request that stopped the room. He asked to speak to his father. What followed from that request was one of the most consequential split-second decisions in the entire investigation. Agent Coda and Agent Lee had seconds to respond. The risk of saying yes was specific and severe. Ronnie Watts was a 62-year-old father who had flown across the country to support his son. If he walked into that room and saw Chris under the visible pressure of that space at that moment, his protective instinct might override everything else. He might tell his son to ask for a lawyer. And the moment those words were spoken, by Ronnie or by anyone else, the interview was over. Chris would invoke his right to counsel, and the entire investigation would be forced to shift onto the forensic evidence alone, without a confession, without directions to where the bodies were. The risk of saying no was that it might harden Chris's resistance at the precise moment he was closest to breaking. Agent Coda and Agent Lee looked at each other. They agreed. They stepped out of the room and walked directly to the observation area to watch. Ronnie Watts came through the door of the interrogation room. He was wearing a polo shirt, embroidered with the words, "Papa Ronnie." That detail is documented in the official case discovery file. When Ronnie walked in, Chris stood up, and they embraced. Father and son, in the interrogation room of the Frederick Police Department, holding each other, while investigators watched in silence from the other side of the glass. Then they sat down. Ronnie's manner was soft-spoken. He rested his forehead in one hand at certain points. Chris sat with his head down, tensed up, speaking quietly. What Chris said to his father was captured on both audio and video recording. And what came out of his mouth in those minutes was the false narrative he had been building in the interrogation room, but spoken now to his own father, about his father's own grandchildren. Chris whispered to Ronnie, She smothered them. They were smothered. He then said, "When I was downstairs, I came back up, and they were gone." He said he heard a commotion upstairs and went up to find his wife on top of their daughter Celeste, choking her. He said he saw Bella, already blue, sprawled out on her bed. He said he had talked to Shanann about the separation, and then, 'cause I freaked out, and I did the same thing to her. Those were my kids. Ronnie wiped his hand over his face. Then he said, "Good God Almighty, son." He did not tell Chris to ask for a lawyer. He sat with his boy. He listened. He was a man trying to find a framework for something that had no acceptable framework. Agent Lee later described watching through the observation glass as one of the most gut-wrenching experiences of the entire investigation. She was watching a father receive a fabricated account of how his grandchildren had died from the man who had killed them. She knew it was false. She knew the forensic evidence that was coming would prove it was false. But the specific weight of watching that dynamic in real time, a father and son in a room together, a story constructed to shift every shred of blame onto a dead woman, was something that stayed with her. When the conversation ended, investigators re-entered the room without delay. The priority now had a single focus: location. Chris had acknowledged that Shanann was dead. The false narrative was on the table. But what no forensic analysis or satellite imaging could tell investigators with the speed they needed was where the bodies actually were. Only Chris could give them that. Back in the interrogation room, investigators pressed him on location. Where are they? Chris gave them the specific account he had settled on. He said he had seen Shanann on the baby monitor, strangling Celeste in the girls' room. He said he found Bella already blue and sprawled on her bed. He said he went into a rage and strangled Shanann. Then he said he loaded all 3 bodies onto the back seat of his work truck and drove to an oil field. He directed them to Survey 319, the Anadarko petroleum oil field site approximately 40 miles north of Frederick, where he worked. He told them Shanann was buried near the site. He told them the girls were in the oil tanks. He marked the locations of the bodies on a photograph of the oil field that investigators placed in front of him. Watts was formally placed under arrest at 11:30 in the evening on August 15, 2018. 3 counts of first-degree murder. 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. He was handcuffed, transported to the Weld County Jail in Greeley, Colorado, and held without bond. A team of investigators drove to Survey 319 within the hour. They arrived at the remote oil field site in the darkness of a Colorado August night, working from the photograph Chris had marked, and began searching the ground near the oil tank battery. They found the grave. Shanann Watts was recovered from a shallow depression in the earth near the oil tank battery. She was face down, curled, as though she had simply been dropped in and the dirt pushed over her. The white bedsheet from the Watts master bedroom was at the site. The top sheet Officer Coonrod had noted as missing during the welfare check. It had been used to wrap her body for transport, and had been buried with her. It was the physical link between the crime scene at the house on Saratoga Trail and the disposal site 40 miles away. The forensic examination of Shanann's body at the scene produced a finding that was not in any investigator's report from the welfare check that afternoon. The amniotic sac, with the fetus inside, had protruded from her body. Nichol Watts, 15 weeks old, already named, already expected by the family that had given him a name, had not survived his mother. The recovery of Bella and Celeste presented a different and significantly more complicated challenge. The crude oil storage tanks at Survey 319 were 400-barrel industrial vessels used to hold the mixture of oil and water extracted from surrounding wells. Each tank had a single access point at the top, a hatch opening measuring 8 inches in diameter, 8 inches across, the opening through which a father had placed the bodies of his 3-year-old and 4-year-old daughters. Draining the tanks was required before any recovery could begin. The process was time-consuming and technically demanding. It ran through the night and into August 16th. On August 16th, 2018, the bodies of Bella and Celeste Watts were recovered from 2 separate crude oil storage tanks at Survey 319. Celeste was still wearing her nightgown. She had gone to bed wearing it the night before the murders. She was still wearing it when she was found. On August 17th, all 3 victims were formally identified by the Weld County coroner. On August 20th, at 4 in the afternoon, Watts was formally charged with 9 felony counts, 3 counts of first-degree murder after deliberation, 2 additional counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of children under the age of 12 by a person in a position of trust, 1 each for Bella and Celeste, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy for Nico, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. Shanann's father, Frank Rzucek Sr., and her brother, Frankie Rzucek Jr., stood alongside prosecutors at the press conference when the charges were announced. On September 1, 2018, a funeral service was held for Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico at Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Pinehurst, North Carolina, not far from Aberdeen, where Shanann had grown up. Shanann's parents and Frankie were present. They buried their daughter and their granddaughters and the grandson who had never taken a breath, in the state where Shanann had gone to school, where she had built her first life, and where she had met, as a young woman rebuilding after illness and heartbreak, the man who would one day take everything she had built and bury it in a field 40 miles from home. The autopsy reports for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste Watts were completed and delivered to prosecutors on October 1, 2018. What those reports contained dismantled, with forensic precision, every single element of the false narrative Christopher Watts had constructed in the interrogation room and delivered to his father. Chris had claimed Shanann harmed the girls. He had told investigators he saw her strangling Celeste on the baby monitor. He had told them Bella was already blue when he found her. He had built an account in which Shanann was the initiator of violence, and he was the man who responded to something unbearable. The autopsies told a different story, an unambiguous one. Shanann Watts died from asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. The autopsy documented specific physical findings: bruising of the right sternocleidomastoid muscle and bruising on the surface of the right side of the thyroid cartilage. These injuries are consistent with a chokehold applied from behind, with the right side of the victim's neck in the crook of the attacker's right arm. There were no defensive wounds on Shanann's body. She had not fought back. Investigators and analysts who reviewed this finding noted it was entirely consistent with the oxycodone found in her system, a substance her husband had been placing in her drinks for weeks without her knowledge. Her body had been chemically compromised before August 13th ever arrived. Celeste Catherine Watts, CSCE, 3 years old, died from asphyxiation due to manual smothering. Bella Marie Watts, 4 years old, also died from asphyxiation due to manual smothering. But Bella's autopsy contained a finding not present in her sister's. There was physical evidence consistent with resistance. Evidence that she had fought against whoever was covering her airway. Evidence that she had tried to survive what was being done to her. The forensic conclusions were unambiguous on every point that mattered. The nature and manner of each victim's death was entirely inconsistent with the account Chris had given investigators. All 3 deaths had been caused by the same individual. The forensic team's conclusion left no room for any alternative reading. The false narrative had been demolished by the evidence of what had actually been done to each victim's body. The toxicology findings for Shanann also confirmed the oxycodone that had been sitting unexplained in the official record since the autopsy was completed. There was no documented prescription, no medical history that accounted for its presence. The finding remained without complete explanation until Chris himself, in letters written to Cheryl Caddell from Dodge Correctional Institution, admitted in writing that he had administered it to her covertly, placed in her drinks over the weeks before August 13th, in an attempt to cause a miscarriage. The admission in the Caddell letters and the oxycodone in the official toxicology report are consistent with each other. The attempt had failed. Shanann had become ill, but remained pregnant. And then, her husband had found another way. Nichol Watts presented prosecutors with a legal challenge that the law as it existed in Colorado at the time could not fully address. Under Colorado statute at the time, an unborn child could not be named as a victim of homicide, regardless of gestational age. Prosecutors filed the only charge the law provided that formally acknowledged Nico's death, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy. It was not a murder charge. It was the only legal mechanism available, the only one, to put his name on the charge sheet and ensure that the fourth life taken in that house on Saratoga Trail was formally recognized in the court record. On paper, the case was closed. Christopher Watts had been arrested. He had been charged with 9 counts. The bodies had been recovered. The forensic evidence had been gathered, processed, and documented. The investigation had done what investigations are supposed to do. But the investigators who had built this case, Agent Lee, Agent Coda, Detective Dave Baumhover of the Frederick Police Department, had not heard the full truth. What Chris had given them in the interrogation room on August 15th was a confession shaped entirely by self-interest. A version of events designed to minimize his culpability, assign blame to his dead wife, and give investigators enough to close the immediate loop without ever revealing the full sequence of what had actually happened. The false narrative about Shanann harming the girls had been demolished by the autopsies. But the autopsies could not tell investigators everything. They could not tell them what had happened to Bella and Celeste in specific detail, in what order, in what location, what the girls had said in their final hours. They could not confirm whether the girls had been alive when they left that house. They could not tell anyone what had happened during the 40-mile drive from Saratoga Trail to Survey 319. Those answers existed in only one place, and reaching them would require one more flight, to a maximum security prison in Wisconsin, to a man serving 3 consecutive life sentences, to one final conversation, 5 hours long, with a killer who had, until that point, only ever told the version of this story that served himself. By the time November arrived, the prosecution team had been constructing the foundation for a murder trial that everyone expected would take years. Evidence was still being processed. Witnesses had not all been fully interviewed. The thorough, exhaustive preparation that a first-degree murder case of this magnitude demands was being built carefully, with the understanding that the process would take the time it needed. Then, on November 6, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts shuffled into a third-floor courtroom at the Weld County District Court in Greeley, Colorado. He was wearing orange jail scrubs with a protective vest over his chest. A sheriff's deputy walked on either side of him. 60 people were packed into every available seat in the gallery. Shanann's parents and her brother sat in the front row, behind the prosecutors. His voice was shaky. It broke at points, but he said the word, guilty. He said it 9 times. 3 counts of first-degree murder after deliberation. 1 for Shanann, 1 for Bella, 1 for Celeste. 2 additional counts of first-degree murder for causing the death of a child under the age of 12, while in a position of trust. 1 each for Bella and Celeste. 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy for Nico. 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. 9 counts. 9 times. The plea deal had one condition. In exchange for those 9 guilty pleas, the Weld County District Attorney would not pursue the death penalty. That decision did not belong to the prosecution alone. Weld County District Attorney Michael Rourke confirmed publicly and in detail that before he agreed to the arrangement, he sat with Shanann's family. He said clearly that he would not have accepted the deal without their explicit endorsement. He gave the family the full context, including the extraordinary delays in Colorado's death penalty system, and the case of a man named Nathan Dunlap, convicted and sentenced to death in 1996, who was still alive decades later because of gubernatorial intervention. He gave them the complete picture of what pursuing the death penalty would mean in practical and emotional terms for the years ahead. Shanann's parents, Frank Rzucek Sr. and Sandra Rzucek, the woman the family called Sandy, had been present through everything. They had sat with the weight of August 13th every single day since it happened, and they sat with the weight of this decision too. Sandy Rzucek spoke, and what she said became, by the account of every person present in those discussions, the single most consequential statement made by any non-investigator throughout the entire case. She said Chris Watts had made the choice to take those lives. She did not want to be in the position of making the choice to take his. That was not a right she wished to exercise. His life, she said, was between him and God, and she prayed that God would have mercy on him, That statement shaped everything that followed. O'Rourke described it as the most compelling factor in the decision. He said there was no version of this outcome in which he was going to go against the expressed wishes of a mother who had buried her daughter, her granddaughters, and her unborn grandson. The plea was accepted. After the guilty pleas were entered, O'Rourke stood before reporters and addressed the false narrative Chris had attempted to construct in the interrogation room, the story in which Shanann had harmed the girls. He said, "The spotlight that he tried to shine on Shanann, falsely, incorrectly, and frankly a flat-out lie, has been corrected. The spotlight shines directly where it belongs. On him." Sentencing was held on November 19, 2018. Judge Marcelo Kopkow presided. The courtroom was packed. Chris sat at the defense table, head down, leg bobbing. Before he heard his sentence, he sat through the victim impact statements. He sat through Frank Razuchek Sr., looking directly at him and saying, "I trusted you to take care of them, not kill them. You have to live with this vision every day of your life, and I hope you see that every day of your life." He sat through Shanann's family calling him a heartless monster. His own mother told him in a prepared statement that she loved him, while his parents acknowledged that what had happened was not condonable and something they would never get over. Chris's attorney told Judge Kopkow that her client was devastated, that though his words were hollow, he was sincerely sorry. When Judge Kopkow asked Chris directly whether he wished to deliver a statement to the court, Chris looked up. He said, "No, sir." Those were the only words he spoke during his entire sentencing proceeding. Judge Kopkow then described the case before him. He had handled thousands of cases in his time on the bench. He called this perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime that he had ever seen in those thousands of cases. Then he sentenced Christopher Lee Watts. 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. 1 for Shanann, 1 for Bella, 1 for Celeste. Consecutive, not concurrent. Each one must be completed before the next begins. 3 consecutive life sentences without parole is, in practical and legal terms, an absolute guarantee that no living human being will ever see Christopher Watts walk free. 2 additional life sentences, 1 each for the murders of Bella and Celeste as children under 12 by a person in a position of trust, to be served concurrently alongside the consecutive terms. 48 additional years for the unlawful termination of a pregnancy, the charge that put Nico's name on the record. 6 additional years for 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. 12 years for each of the 3 people whose remains he had disposed of in a shallow grave and crude oil storage tanks. 5 life sentences. 84 additional years. No parole, no appeal pathway. On December 3, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts was transferred out of Colorado. 2 days later, on December 5, he arrived at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, a maximum security facility. The Wisconsin Department of Corrections confirmed to Inside Edition Digital that the Colorado Department of Corrections made the decision to transfer him out of state after a security incident 1 month into his Colorado sentence. His notoriety had made him an immediate and sustained target for violence. In the Weld County Jail during the months leading to sentencing, the facility had to lock down the entire inmate population just to move him down a single hallway. In February of 2019, 3 months after the sentencing, with the legal case formally closed, 3 investigators boarded a flight to Wisconsin. Special Agent Graham Coder of the FBI, Agent Tammy Lee of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, Detective Dave Baumhover of the Frederick Police Department, the same 3 people who had sat in the interrogation room on August 15th. The same 3 who had watched through the observation glass while Chris whispered to his father in a polo shirt that said Papa Ronnie. They flew to Dodge Correctional Institution, not because the law required it. The case was closed. There were no open charges, no pending hearings, nothing legally outstanding. They went because they believed that Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico were owed the full truth. And the full truth had not yet been spoken. The interview was conducted on February 18, 2019. The full audio was released publicly in March of that same year. It lasted 5.5 hours. Chris was brought out to meet them. When he saw who was in the room, he paused for a brief second before recognition showed on his face. He asked how they were doing. He said he had not expected to see them. Agent Coder explained that they were not there about an open investigation. Nothing Chris said could result in additional charges or add a single day to his sentence. He asked Chris if he was available to speak. Chris said, "Definitely." The conversation that followed over the next 5.5 hours covered everything the August 15th confession had deliberately withheld. The first thing Coder addressed was the false narrative. He told Chris they needed him to say on the record that Shanann had not harmed the girls. That the story he had given in the interrogation room was a lie. Chris confirmed it, without hesitation. Shanann did not harm the girls. He recanted it completely and clearly. On the record. In front of all three of them. Then he told them what had actually happened. He described telling Shanann he did not love her anymore. He described the conversation escalating. He described Shanann telling him he would never see the children again. He told investigators he put both of his hands around his wife's neck and strangled her. Every time he thinks about it, he told them, he asks himself, did I know I was going to do that before I got on top of her? He wrapped Shanann in the bedsheet from the master bed. He tried to carry her downstairs. She was too heavy. He dragged her. He bundled her into the back of his truck, covering her face and her feet with garbage bags. Then he described what Bella had seen. Bella watched him carry her mother's body downstairs and load her into the truck. She started crying a little bit, Chris told investigators. She asked, "What's wrong with Mommy?" That is when Celeste woke up. He put both girls in the back seat of the truck. Below their feet, on the floor of the cab, was their mother's body. Then he said the thing that reframed everything. Both girls were alive when the truck left Saratoga Trail. They were alive for the entire 40-mile drive to Survey 319, approximately 1 hour. During the drive, Chris told investigators, the girls dozed off and on and laid in each other's laps. No investigator who worked this case had considered this possibility before the Wisconsin confession. It was not in any report. It was not a scenario that had been formally discussed. When Chris said it in that room on February 18th, the three investigators sitting across from him received it in the specific silence that follows information that changes everything you thought you understood. At the oil field site at Survey 319, Chris took Shanann's body out of the truck and placed it on the ground. Both girls were still in the back seat. And then, from inside the truck, they asked him a question. They asked, "What are you doing to Mommy?" He did not answer them. He laid Shanann on the ground. Then, he returned to the truck for Celeste. He smothered Celeste first. He used a blanket over her face. Her own blanket, the one she slept with. The blanket that investigators had noted was missing from her bed during the welfare check on August 13th. When he knew Celeste was gone, he carried her body to the first oil tank and placed her through the 8-inch hatch at the top. He dropped her inside. Then, he walked back to the truck. Bella had been in the back seat the entire time. She had watched her father walk away with her little sister. She had watched him approach the oil tank. She had watched what happened. And when he returned to the truck and opened the door, she looked at him. She asked, "What happened to Cece?" And then she asked, "Is the same thing going to happen to me as Cece?" Chris told investigators he did not know if he said yes, like a horrible person, or if he just put the blanket over her and began. He could not recall exactly. He said he hears it every single day in prison. He said that her final words to him, the last thing she ever said to her father, were, "Daddy, no." He told investigators, "I wasn't thinking. If I was thinking, none of this would have happened. With any partial hint of what I feel for those girls, and what I feel for my wife, none of this would have happened. I wasn't thinking." The Weld County DA's office later described the full 5.5-hour Wisconsin interview as among the most disturbing documents in the case record. Agent Tammy Lee said in documented accounts that the Wisconsin confession was worse than anything she had allowed herself to imagine before walking into that room. She said that when she got home that Friday evening, she kissed her own children, walked upstairs, and collapsed on the floor. She said it was not the facts alone that broke her. It was the hours. It was the tone. It was the absolute gap between what was being described and what the man describing it appeared to feel as he described it. When investigators asked Chris directly whether any part of what he did to the girls was intended as a mercy, whether he had believed he was sparing them from a difficult life without their mother, his answer was immediate. No. He said it was anger. He said he was directing rage at everyone who was in front of him that morning. He was angry at Shanann, angry about the separation, angry about being told he would not see the children, and he took that anger out on everyone in his path. He offered nothing else. Michael Rourke said afterward that in most cases, once everything has been documented and the full picture assembled, you arrive at some sense of the why. You may not agree with it, but you can trace the logic. Here, the why never materialized. The explanation Chris gave, anger, taken out on everyone in front of him, did not account for the weeks of planning, the oxycodone, the school call, the realtor call, the deliberate and methodical execution of 4 deaths followed by an ordinary workday. It did not account for any of it in a way that added up. That absence, Rourke said, was what stayed with everyone who worked this case. As of 2026, Christopher Lee Watts is 40 years old. He is incarcerated at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, where he has been since December 5, 2018. He works as a custodian in the facility. He exercises once or twice per day, Monday through Friday. He participates in Bible study. He is described by sources as acutely isolated, aware that other inmates regard him as the lowest category of offender, a man who killed his children, and that many express violent intent toward him. He largely avoids eye contact with other inmates. He has gained weight since his incarceration and has lost most of his hair. He has received 2 documented conduct violations at Dodge. The first, in 2020, was for unauthorized forms of communication and unauthorized transfer of property. The second, in 2021, was for disobeying orders and possession of miscellaneous contraband. He keeps photographs of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste in his cell. A source told People magazine that he claims to speak to the photographs every morning and evening and reads books aloud to his daughters. A public petition demanding the removal of those photographs gathered more than 20,000 signatures. The Department of Corrections stated there was no legal basis for removal. The photographs remain. He has maintained correspondence with multiple women during his incarceration. He responds to all of them. In 2021, Chris co-authored a self-published book of prayers with a fellow Dodge inmate named Dylan Tallman, a man placed in the neighboring cell to Chris with whom he became close. The book was titled Revelation in the Reckoning. Tallman has publicly stated he believes Chris is innocent. In letters obtained by the Daily Mail and News Nation, and reported in August and October of 2025, Chris wrote extensively to a female pen pal named Deborah. In a letter written in October 2025, he told her, "God had a plan for me. He wants me in prison. This is His will, just like it was His will for Jesus to die for us." He added, "I will never fully understand what Christ went through when He was crucified, but my trials have given me a glimpse of it." He told Deborah he had converted to Christianity in prison and considered himself a new man. He wrote, "I am not the person who committed those horrible acts." In an earlier set of letters, he described Nichol Kessinger as a harlot and a Jezebel. He wrote, "I have always taken full responsibility for what I did, even though I was misled by a wicked woman. She was a harlot, a Jezebel who led me astray, who spoke sweet words of destruction." These letters contradict everything he said about Kessinger in the formal investigative record and in the Wisconsin confession, in which he described the relationship as his choice, his pursuit, something he had willingly maintained. In the prison letters, he rewrote that account entirely and placed the blame on a woman who had been deceived by him, who cooperated fully with investigators, and who has spent the years since this case trying to disappear. The family home at 2825 Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado, was sold on October 17, 2024 for $650,000. The home had originally been listed in April of that year for $775,000. The price was reduced multiple times. The final sale price represented a significant discount compared to comparable homes in the Wyndham Hill subdivision that had not been featured in a Netflix documentary. The exterior of the house has since been repainted from its original color in an apparent effort to alter its appearance. New owners live there now. Nichol Kessinger has not made any public statement since her interview with the Denver Post in November of 2018. Reports as of early 2000 and 2006 suggest she may be living under a different name, having relocated away from Colorado. She has not appeared publicly. Whatever she carried out of this case, she has carried it privately and without comment. Shanann Watts said something once, in one of the hundreds of Facebook Live sessions she recorded from her living room in Frederick, talking directly to the camera the way she always did, relaxed, honest, and completely herself. She said, "I believe that everything in life happens for a reason. I also believe that people are placed in our lives for a reason." She said she was addicted to creating memories. She said she wanted to live life to its fullest, every day, without apology. She was 34 years old when she died. She had navigated a lupus diagnosis that had derailed her career and reshaped her 20s. She had rebuilt from bankruptcy. She had built a business, a following, and a public life that looked like the product of someone who refused to be defeated by anything. She had written love letters to a man who threw them in the garbage. She had ordered a book to save her marriage and watched it disappear without comment. She had told her friends she would fight for her daughters if it came to that. She had kept going, all the way up to 1:48 in the morning on August 13, 2018, when she walked through her own front door carrying a suitcase after a long work trip, and the going stopped. Bella Marie Watts was 4 years old. The family called her Bells. She was quiet and thoughtful, and she waved at the neighbors from across the backyard with a deliberateness that made adults feel genuinely seen. She fought back when someone covered her airway in the back seat of a truck at an oil field 40 miles from home. The autopsy said so. Before that, at the oil site, she asked a question. She asked, "What happened to sir?" And then she asked, "Is the same thing going to happen to me as sir?" She was 4 years old. She knew something was catastrophically wrong. She tried to understand it with the only tools she had. Celeste Catherine Watts was 3 years old. The firecracker. The belly laugh that filled every room it entered. She had a nut allergy so serious that her mother carried an EpiPen every time they left the house together. She was wearing her nightgown when she was found. She had gone to bed the night before last wearing it. She had it on still. Nichol Lee Watts had a name. He had parents who had announced him on camera with visible joy, who had already decided what to call him, who had already made room for him in the life they were building. He was 15 weeks old, and he had a name, and the law that was supposed to protect him did not have a category for what was done to him, so prosecutors used the only mechanism available and put his name on the charge sheet anyway. Because his name deserved to be there. The investigators who worked this case flew to Wisconsin in February of 2019, not because the law required them to. The case was closed. The sentence was entered. There was nothing legally outstanding. They flew because they believed the 4 people whose names were on those charge sheets were owed the full truth. Not the version that served the man who had taken their lives. The actual truth. Sandy Rzucek stood in a Weld County courtroom in November of 2018 and said she did not want the power to make the choice that Chris Watts had made. She handed that power back. She said his life was between him and God. And then she walked out of that building carrying what this case had left her, the way you carry unbearable things, not because they become lighter, but because you do not put them down. Frank Rzucek Sr. told the man who killed his daughter, "You have to live with this vision every day of your life, and I hope you see it every day of your life." Christopher Lee Watts will die at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. 3 consecutive life sentences, 84 additional years. No parole, no release date, no second act. He is 40 years old and he will die there. He reads books aloud to photographs of the daughters he murdered. He compares his incarceration to the suffering of Jesus Christ. He calls Nichol Kessinger a Jezebel. He calls himself a new man. He said no, sir, when the judge asked if he had anything to say. He had 9 months, from August 13th to November 6th, to decide what he wanted to say. He chose nothing. That is the outcome the law produced. It is not justice for Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. There is no legal sentence in existence that constitutes justice for what was taken from those 4 people in those hours between 1:48 and 5:46 on the morning of August 13th. There is only the law doing what it can, removing the person who did it and making certain he stays removed. That is all that remains. If this case moved you, if any part of what you heard across these chapters stayed with you, share this video. Every person who watches it is one more person who knows their names. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, Nico. Subscribe to True Crime Blackwood for a new case every week, covered with the depth and gravity it deserves. Drop a comment below. Do you believe the account Chris Watts gave in Wisconsin on February 18, 2019 was the full truth? Or is there still something, some piece of what happened in that house, on that drive, at that oil field, that he has never said and never will? We will see you in the next one.